All right, we're recording. Hey everybody. So here we're doing another reader conversation. I'm here with Jack today, and this is going to be basically an addendum or a part two of the Black Lives Matter discussion I started with Keegan a couple weeks ago. And just as a refresher for anyone, basically what we did was we discussed. Keegan took the position of pro Black Lives Matter, and I kind of just played devil's advocate towards his position, and we kind of had a conversation and saw what we could learn. And so we're going to do the inverse today. So Jack will basically take the position of anti BLM or basically the position I had last time, and I'll play devil advocate to his position again, and again we'll try to see what we can learn and where we get to. But first, I guess we should start with we are obviously, as you can tell, we're not showing our faces this time. And so I guess I'll let Jack kind of take it from there. Well, first, Jack, how's it going?
Good, Max. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, you're welcome anytime. And so would you like to say a little something about why you requested that we like don't show our faces or like what is your position on that?
Yeah, initially I didn't think about this too much, but the more I started thinking about it, the more I was concerned because I think this is actually one of the problems I want to start discussing is the fact that I'm not either revealing my face or my real name. Because around this topic there has been a sort of what I've seen is sort of a vilification or misrepresentation of people that are skeptical about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've seen people get fired, people lose their jobs, people, basically a sort of cancel culture has been created around this that I think really hinders any legitimate discussion or helps people understand basically what the better parts of the movement are about, right? And I think this lack of discussion is a big problem with the movement itself, or some parts of the movement. That is, I want to say, because again, if you cut the opposition's tongue out, you're not proving them wrong in that case. You're just what you're saying there is you're just saying you're afraid of what they have to say. So I think that's generally not the case for the other side. I think they have very positive things to say. So I think that's one aspect of the discussion that's lacking.
Sure. Right. Like, and I think even lots of supporters, and even talking a couple weeks ago again with Keegan, hopefully I don't misrepresent his views, but we basically did kind of discuss the same thing, right? Like there's a culture, especially on the internet, especially on Twitter, especially amongst like young people, of not actually engaging with topics on the level of ideas, but instead engaging with like just dunking or whatever, this like canceling or whatever you want to call it, right? This idea of like coming after a person just because they disagree with you on like personal grounds and attempting to get them fired or what have you. And I think even right, like this will be something we run into a lot, but like right, not every person that like pronounces Black Lives Matter is also in favor of like completely silencing the other side, right? I think this is something that me and Keegan especially agreed on a ton of, right? Which was that, yeah, of course, these are the conversations we need to be having, right? We need to be, whether you're a supporter of Black Lives Matter or you think they've made mistakes or you're like opposed to their movement or what have you, for whatever reason, you have to be willing to engage with the other side and talk to them and convince them if you actually want to like quote unquote win or convince people or like institute actual substantive change in the world. So I think, yeah, it's just, yeah, it's a problem, right? And it's kind of it's absurd that like you feel as if, and in my opinion, like rightly, that like there's a unnecessary danger to you and your future by like posting your face and your name along with a like substantive, very like reasonable critique of a like very important movement that's happening right now. So it's like it's kind of sad that that's like where we've gotten to, right? And it's not it's not descriptive of the entire movement, right? But it is.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue that it's not a part of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you with the fact that I shouldn't have this fear, right? But nevertheless, I think it's a fear that's legitimate because, I mean, just to list some anecdotal examples, like there was a player, I believe, in the soccer player in the LA Galaxy um, that was basically kicked out of the team or fired because of something his wife said on social media. So not even something he said. That I believe it was going against um, something related to Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of important, right? What we're trying to do here, um, at least what I love about the void and about these conversations that we're trying to have, right, is that we're trying to use the anonymity of the internet, right, to our advantage, right? So would it be great to be able to attach our names and faces to everything we say on the internet? Of course, like ups, makes you more careful about what you say, makes you think deeper about what you say, of course, but like also in a culture where there is a however large segment of the population that believes in shutting down conversation, it's nice to be able to use anonymity, right? Because then it kind of like it ties their hands behind their back, right? Their only weapon is to come after you in your personal life because they don't actually want to engage on the level of ideas. And that's not to say it's the whole movement, right? I keep saying this, maybe I'm being too soft, but there's plenty of
No,
people
I
that
also
like,
wanted to just say that you sort of said I was um, here as a representative basically of like anti-Black Lives Matter, and I want to just say that um, it's not necessarily that I'm anti um, BLM. It's just the case that I have problems with the movement, significant problems with the movement that basically make me skeptical about subscribing to it. Um, and before I actually get into the problems I had with the movement, I just wanted to get into some of the things that I think are good, right? Um,
sure,
which
sure,
are
let's,
basically, I thought there's a lot of things that were brought to light, um, problems with policing in America that perhaps wouldn't have been um, examined as closely if Black Lives Matter hadn't you know shine a spotlight on these issues, like um, basically making body cams universal, right? Accountability, um, and qualified immunity, which is a separate issue that I don't know if we're going to have time to get into, but that's a separate thing. I don't know if I agree necessarily with that or not, but um, it's still something that's worth discussing, you know.
absolutely, right? Like I
All
think
good
that's the,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, I think that, and I think defenders of the movement, right, are, that's kind of their biggest point, right, is that like whatever you want to say about the tactics or the mistakes that the movement made or the problems with it, the biggest benefit of it is that we're now having a discussion about policing and about reform and about how to improve the lives of people. And I think, yeah, no matter what you say, even if you fall on the opposite end of the issues that they're trying to raise, I think it's hard to say that the discussion itself is like a negative, right? The discussion seems to be a positive, that we can at least, as long as we're willing to engage actually on the issues, I think it's a positive. But anyway, so that was kind of a long preamble, but if you want, what we'll do is we'll kind of do the opposite of what I had Keegan do, which was lay out his position kind of for Black Lives Matter. And if you want to just in the broadest possible strokes, and then we'll dig in, lay out what are your biggest problems with the movement. Why do you feel it, like why do you feel it necessary to come on and respond and like give the anti point of view? If you want to just riff on that.
Well, first of all, I saw you guys's your discussion with Keegan, and I thought that was something that was awesome. You know, there's very little of that that's actually publicized in discussions like that that are put on, and there's a lot of things I agree with Keegan, a lot of things, some things that I didn't think were covered as much in depth that I wanted to come on. And again, thanks for inviting me for coming on. I think that's a good idea to sort of, you know, expand these discussions. I think that's interesting. But anyways, getting a little bit into um, sort of the problems I have with the movement. Um, I had basically three main points that I wanted to go over. Um, there are other minor problems I have, but there are some um, basically things that are more apparent that I think not only if the movement addresses, um, they could get, what I see is that if problems like these are addressed, or maybe problems that are posed by skeptics on the other side are addressed by the movement, um, there can only be improvement, um, uh, even if some of these problems are again um, perhaps shown to be irrelevant. But I think some of the ones I'm about to cover um, are things that have been um, brought out quite frequently. So, anyways, um, one of the things I have that I want to mention is, first of all, the lack of leadership in the movement, which is something you and Keegan covered that I thought was interesting, and it's something I have a problem with in the Black Lives Matter movement, is that you sort of get basically this cacophony of voices, right, from all sides of the Black Lives Matter movement, um, that makes it so that the message becomes unclear to somebody who is not as familiar with it. And again, there's a lot of things that contradict each other, right? You have um, different sorts of people that are flying the Black Lives Matter movement, right? You have, again, legitimate protesters, and then you have rioters, right? Um, which is a problem, because when you see the footage of people rioting on the streets, um, as um, as a result of um, again flying under this Black Lives Matter movement, people are drawn away from that, and no one benefits from that sort of you know uh, damage that is caused to the communities. And that's not only that's by no means only white communities, it's also Black communities and independent business owners and things like that. So you sort of get confused, at least I did initially, about what exactly um, the movement is trying to achieve, right? And again, there's a lot of reasonable people that will point out that no, these people are actually not part of the movement, um, which I think is right. But I think there's not enough, basically, separation, uh, and more clear definition of of what the movement is saying and what the movement is for.
Yeah, right. This is kind of the biggest or kind of most obvious problem that people have with the movement, right? It's like if I were to walk down like to the nearest city and during a BLM protest and I were to start just pulling random people out of a march, I would very like reasonably expect to get quite a few different answers as to like what they're marching for, what the movement stands for, especially when you get down to the level of like you get broad agreement about like we're marching for justice for George Floyd and for victims of police shootings. But when you actually, if you actually were to drill down on like what substantive policy changes are you pushing for, like why are you marching, I would expect, and I think it evidence probably bears out that like you would get a very wide ranging like level of differences, right? And ranging from like quite reasonable and quite mainstream to right like on the fringes, quite fringe and quite extreme propositions. um
Yep.
so I think that's definitely like I think all of these things we're going to raise are probably fair critiques of the movement. If I'm going to put on my contrarian hat, I think the position of supporters of the movement are, um, at least if I think the strongest position is probably something like if don't like it's not fair or like you should not engage with the movement on the level of its most extreme ideas, right? It's like a straw man fallacy, right? Or whatever those things are called, right? To engage with the movement's most extremist people, right? Like since anyone can consider themselves supporters of BLM, right? To characterize the movement as riots only or as right to focus only on like Antifa people trying to burn down courthouses in Portland is to strawman the movement as a whole and to avoid engaging on the actual substantive issues that the core of the movement is about, right? It's to ignore the problems with policing and to like evade the substantive problems that BLM is trying to raise. I think that would be the defense of that critique. What do you say to that?
I'd say it's definitely the case that you should do your research. But the thing is, nowadays there's very few people that actually have the time and go and do the research like I did and see that there's actually, some valid parts of the movement. And that I think is because of a problem with leadership, like I mentioned before. Again, you have, like I said, this cacophony of voices coming from all different sides with sometimes contradicting opinions. And what often happens is the voices that are the loudest are the ones that are actually heard. And the loudest voices are not necessarily the most intellectually sound in that case.
Yeah.
They're
So
often, yeah.
yeah. So what you're making the point is almost like this critique is almost a critique of it's a failure of the movement in a sense that like they're leaving themselves open to attack from people who attempt to like thwart the more like serious parts of the movement, right? Like this is almost not like a critique of the movement itself as it is like a critique of their strategy if their goal is actually to institute change in the world, right? Is that right? You agree with that characterization?
Yeah. I feel like it draws away from the reasonable aspects of the movement significantly. And again, I was watching your discussion with Keegan, and he did mention the point that um, the fact that there's no leadership in the movement allows for different voices to speak out that might not have spoken out if there was one central figure. But again, the thing is, if you don't have a central figure as a spokesman for the movement, there's a lot of sort of things that um, devolve, right? First of all, you don't have a person who legislators can come to ask for advice, in creating new laws and establishing and getting what the people want. You have somebody over here that says this is what should be done, and you have somebody over here on the other side that says no, this is actually um, a greater priority. And again, you know, basic economics says we have scarce resources, and we can't be spending money here and there. So there has to be some sort of coherence to um, certain. There has to be given certain things. The movement have to be given priority over others.
Yeah,
Right?
there has to be a clear there. What BLM? I think I think it'd be hard to argue, even if you're a supporter of the movement, that there is such thing as a very coherent, clear ideology, like a political policy-based ideology underlying the movement itself, right? There's a lot of anger and a lot of justified anger and a lot of things, right? Like there's a lot of like buzzy kind of topics that the movement is about, right? We all know BLM has to do with police shootings and police violence and
Yeah.
racial injustice all that stuff, but like what is the actual substantive underlying ideology is still kind of very amorphous and hard to get your hand on, right? So as you're saying, right, me, if I was a legislator, am I looking to like institute the BLM policy, what they're fighting for? I'm left kind of right hanging in the wind, not exactly sure what to do to like address the concerns that the movement is raising.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, another point that sort of adds to this incoherence that I was talking about, besides leadership, is um, a lack of um, sort of semantics, the problem of semantics in the movement, right? The meanings of certain words that are used very frequently. Um, for example, the biggest example is systemic racism, right? Um, that's a word that's often not given a clear definition, and as a result can have many different interpretations. Um, which again is a problem because you have, um, if you have people not agreeing about a certain definition, about a word that's basically central to the movement, then you don't, basically someone outside of that who's trying to sympathize doesn't know what that means or what is being criticized. Or,
Right. Me and Keegan talked about this, right? I think I used the term like the terms are semantic overloaded, right? Like when someone says Black Lives Matter, again, right? If I'm pulling random people off the street and I'm like, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you versus what does it mean to Joe Schmo next to you? You guys are going to give me probably substantively different answers, right? And then the more and more we drill down into more and more specific terms, instead of converging on definitions, we actually diverge on definitions quite often, right? When I'm like, what does systemic racism mean to you versus you? It's very, very different. And again, I think I raised this with Keegan as a problem. I don't know if we why is that why do you think that's particularly nefarious or a problem or dangerous, like to have this lack of agreement on what these like very big broad buzzword terms mean?
well, again, um, the problem with not having this sort of coherence is because you end up having a lot of people um, getting basically attacked or or vilified, that are asking these questions, right? Um, and you don't understand. Basically, draws people away from the movement that are basically skeptical, right, about what the movement's about. Because they come in and they're like, "This is what I think the movement is about," right? And then you have somebody on the other side saying, "No, that's you've got the wrong definition or you've got the wrong idea." Um, and it's like, well, this guy says the opposite of what you do. And I see a lot of that. Again, this brings us back to the problem of that we mentioned in the beginning, that I've seen people ask these questions, right? Like asking for definitions of, for example, systemic racism, um, and people saying that posing the question itself, the posing of the question itself is, inherently racist. Which again, it's a problem. It hinders discussion, right? It hinders understanding between the two sides, which I think at this point is, paramount.
And that kind of touches on something that me and Keegan talked about, right? Which is there's many divergent definitions of all these kinds of terms, but the biggest one is racism is often used almost interchangeably, meaning the, like, as me and Keegan said, the like white hooded KKK member cross burning on the lawn, like 1940s style racist person, versus like this new kind of you're being systemically racist, which means in a lot of ways, right? Like the definition is something like you don't actually have to be consciously being discriminatory towards Black people to be forwarding the system of systemic racism, I think is the definition they would give. And so what do you think? And they do seem to be like, those terms are kind of slung around, especially online, interchangeably, right? Like that's racist may mean systemically racist, may mean, it's hard to tell, right, what that person is attempting to call you, or claim you're doing. And I think the defenders of the movement would say that, yeah, like when we're saying that's racist or it's racist to ask that question, right? The need to ask that question is a example of this sort of systemic racism. The idea that you, right, like as someone, like you as a person who hasn't experienced racism because of the system, right, you haven't experienced these problems that like people face in the inner cities and with police, the fact that you have to ask what is systemic racism is in fact evidence of the fact that the system is so bifurcated along racial lines that you're able to live your life in ignorance of that of the like lived experience of other minority people. I think that'd be what they say. There's a number of ways you could, like, I'd like to get your opinion on. Do you think it's, I know personally, since we talked offline, that you have problems with the entire idea of systemic racism itself, which we can get into, but do you have a more specific problem with this interchangeable use of the two terms of racism? Do you think that's like an issue, or
Mhm.
or would you rather dig into the idea of systemic racism itself?
Actually, well, let's see. You give me two options here. Well, the way I was gonna go is I was actually gonna um, point out my problem with the what I've heard is the most common definition of systemic racism.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And just
Well,
as a preface, so this would be, now we're starting to dig into what I think everyone kind of has to agree is foundational to the movement itself, right? This is
yeah,
a critique of the underlying ideology as best as we can get a hold of it, versus a like critique of the way the movement is manifesting itself in the world as in leaderless. Is like that, and are you in agreement with that characterization?
yes. This is less of sort of a structural critique than more of like the actual philosophical critique of the movement.
Sweet, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. So basically the more common definition I've heard of systemic racism, as it is defined, is sort of a racism that is inherent in the system and does not necessarily require racism on the part of individuals, right? And I think my problem with that, I actually have a huge problem with that, which is the fact that you remove people's individuality.
So
right?
just real quick, right? Like the most common example of this I think I've heard of like systemic racism is and I know we talked about this offline as well. You brought up this example of like housing is the biggest one, right? Redlining is instituted under Jim Crow, and there's a bunch of like racist policies that are forcing African American families and Black people into the ghetto and not letting them into the suburbs where the opportunity is. And this kind of creates this cyclical version of poverty. And even after all those laws are removed in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and we're now in 2020 where there are no actively racist laws on the books, and possibly even no actively racist like white hood wearing actors in the system, we've created this system that's kind of holding Black people back in like a unconscious way, right? Like the system is operating outside the bounds of us as the individual actors that build up the system itself. And that's not that's just as an example.
You gave a pretty good summary of what I was about to say, which I was about to sort of go back a couple of years and I'll explain that a little bit later. But anyways, the problem with that definition is it sort of removes the individual aspect, right? It labels, it says that basically these individuals in the system have no conscious free will of their own, right? They are being acted upon by forces that are outside of their control and forces that are not defined, and maybe even forces that don't necessarily have a head honcho. And this is, and again, it brings the question to the table that, well, where exactly are these forces, right? And again, that's where I was going to go back to the 1950s and 60s when racism was actually legislated. It was in the laws. You saw it in the behavior and the actions of individuals. Going back to the 1950s, after World War II, you had the United States government basically give several housing loans as the suburbs were being constructed, right? And as people were moving away from the cities and the highways were being built. And in the law books, there was laws that specifically said that these housing loans were to be given exclusively or preferentially to white families rather than Black families, right? Like explicit racial prejudice. And what happened as a result of that is that white families moved away from the inner cities, right, to places where there was a growing sort of economic stimulus and environment. And then you had Black families basically remaining within these inner city suburbs that were, again, older houses and deteriorating neighborhoods. And basically you had the opposite, right? You didn't have a growing economic environment. You had a shrinking economic environment as business started to move away. Basically, their headquarters started to move away from the inner cities. And again, you're left with these poor Black neighborhoods in the inner cities, and you have these white, predominantly white suburbia that surrounds it, right? And you see, there's no question of where this came from, right? You see it in the law books of the days past, right? Of the past, where you see explicit racism written in the laws and in the actions of individuals and in the actions of the banks and the institutions of the time. And the thing is, nowadays, right, I have a hard time, at least I haven't found any examples of such laws that are explicitly racially prejudiced, right? Or I haven't seen actions or explicit actions by politicians or individuals that are, well, in my opinion, to be labeled racist, right? As these actions were in the past. So that's my primary problem with the definition of systemic racism, is because I simply see no clear evidence for.
Sure. So if I can reiterate your position and tell me if I'm grokking it correctly, like if I'm reiterating it correctly, right? So your position is, right, systemic racism, as in this idea that racism is built directly into our institutions and our systems, was unarguably evident after after World War II and during the Jim Crow South. And I mean, obviously, if you go back further than that, in the institution of slavery, right, like that is the primary definition of systemic racism, right? It is built into the fabric of the country and the fabric of our institutions. And as we removed these laws off the books, and as we passed the Civil Rights Act, and as we opened up society, and as we de-racialized our institutions, you're claiming that was like that to continue to call the way the system functions today as quote unquote systemically racist is to, as you said, deprive individual actors within the system of free will or choice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's almost makes people out to be sort of like cogs in a machine,
sure.
right?
And the secondary point I think you were making was like, not only are they just cogs in the machine, but they're not even subject to the forces of the institutions as constructed, right? The institutions themselves are subject to these even like higher order forces that are not even written down, right? Like there's no racism explicitly in the system anymore, but the system still functions in a racist manner. And you think that is like we're starting to grasp we're starting to make logical leaps that weren't necessary to make in the 50s and the 60s.
Again, one question I wanted to one thing I wanted to pose is that there is no question that there's a problem with the fact that Blacks and other minorities are disproportionately poorer than white Americans, right? I think very few people are going to look at that and be able to justify that that's okay, right? There's definitely a problem there, and I just wanted to say that. However, the problem, the question is, again, is brought to the table is the problem because the system is today actively oppressing minorities, or is it because of sort of things that were done in the past? And again, for example, after World War II, we had a lot of money to spend, and we spend it in such a way that was racially prejudiced. And now we don't have the money we had in the past. And we're left with, again, the sort of situation we're left with now, right? And the question is, well, I see that, and I see that as sort of, I believe, to be the root cause. It seems to be the most apparent, at least in my opinion, or to the evidence that was presented to me. And again, it doesn't fit with the definition of racism, right? At least the reality I see doesn't fit with that definition.
Right. So this is kind of the crux of the entire argument, and this is, in my opinion, this is where like this is the kind of level that like good intellectual debate is supposed to happen on, right? Like this is a very very minute detail in a sense, right? Like we're not arguing over like whether or not racism has ever existed, or black people in the inner cities are starting at a different point than white people in the suburbs today, or anything like that, right? We're arguing over, when you say systemic racism, to say that the system is, there's a difference between like actively and like almost passively, so like pushing back, or like making it more difficult for black people to succeed, right? Actively attempting to hold black people back, as unarguably the system did in the 50s, it seems to be that you're making the point, is substantively different than almost passively holding black people back because of the echoes of these systemic structures that have now been removed. And so to conflate those two as one and the same, you seem to be arguing is like a mistake, or dangerous, or like just like non-specific in a way.
Yeah, again, the problem is again, you're removing anyone in the system's basically individual freedom of choice and freedom of, it's almost like we don't have control over their actions. And I think that's very dangerous, because it's very, again, there's very little, it's almost like it's sort of like there's no evidence for it, right? It's almost like you say it, and initially it sort of makes sense, right? It's sort of like a proposed explanation to the problems I have stated. But then the more you think about it, the more you start to see the problem with removing that individuality from people, right? Because that's not the case, right? People have, at least I feel like most people would concede to the fact that people have freedom of choice, right? That an individual would know whether they are racist or not, right? There's a problem with telling people what they think, right? It's like,
sure, right. Like this is right. This is kind of where we drill down into where I think, and maybe I'm showing that like in the final analysis, I probably come down closer to you than like as a supporter of BLM. So maybe I'm not doing great at pushing back on the position, but I think this is kind of where BLM and specifically people who espouse this kind of idea of systemic, new age systemic racism, even without the racist policies specifically on the books, kind of overshoot their skis, or lean too far over on whatever that freaking saying is about skis. You know what I'm talking about? They overstep their boundaries, right? In the description, like I'm with you, right? I'm with you as you walk me down the line of redlining and forcing black people out of the suburbs, and denying them economic opportunity. And now even after we removed all these policies in the books, now what do you have? You have like areas with low economic opportunity, lots of crime, lots of young men being removed from the like whole system because of crime and drugs and all these things. And then you expect that young black children raised in like the south side of Baltimore to like suddenly realize that if they just like keep their head down and go to school and don't join a gang, that they can actually succeed and get to the suburbs, because those barriers are gone now, right? But like it's kind of hard to see how that kid can ever realize that that's even an option, right? When he doesn't see that option. I see that, but where I think they start to overstep their boundaries is when you start to attempt to apply this idea of systemic racism to more specific and different institutions, right? So to bring this to policing in general, right? The idea that the police themselves are systemically racist in the act that they're actively oppressing or holding back African Americans or black people in these in inner cities, I think is where that argument starts to weaken. Would you like to? What do you think about that?
well, in that case, Max, that's where the data comes in, right? there are several studies that have been done. And of course, I'm not going to say that every study is perfect, right? But data is always superior to um, anecdotal evidence. However, despite questions of bias, and these are the best studies that have been basically done. There were several, I believe there was, and these studies were done on the question of whether basically police were more likely to use lethal force, or were you more likely to use force um, against an individual based on his skin color, right? Um, and there was one study done by some public health researchers. The most famous one is by Roland Fryer, the Harvard study, that I believe was mentioned in the article you guys talked about by Sam. There was also one done by an economist named Sindil. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but Sindil Mullainathan, and another one done by David Johnson, who I believe is also an economist. And all these studies found that, again, there was no racial prejudice when it came to police using lethal force against individuals. And well, the question is brought to the table, right? That you see, what people tend to see is the fact that police tend to use lethal force more with blacks than with white Americans, black Americans than with white Americans. When they see data, for example, that says that police interactions involve 35% lethal force, and force in general are used against 35% of the people that are used against are African Americans, whereas African Americans only comprise approximately 14% of the U.S. population, right? But in that case, you have to account for confounding variables, right? And that's exactly what these studies did. For example, it tends to be the case that in minority communities, the crime rate is, again, higher. It tends to be higher. And you have to ask yourself, well, this is data, right? This is things that are, again, studies that were repeated multiple times. And you see this trend. You have to ask yourself, well, why is that the case, right? It also tends to be the case that minority communities are disproportionately poor, right? And within poor communities, that tends to be a higher rate of crime. That's just sort of a fact. And we've already gone over what I see to be the root cause of this, right? Of this seemingly like inherent poverty in these communities. And again, what these studies found, actually, the Fryer study found that when accounting for these confounding variables, it was actually, this is actually a very strange finding. They found that police were actually more likely to use lethal force against whites than against blacks. However, when it came to just force in general, such as like the use of a baton, like non-lethal force, the use of a baton, or give me 1 second here.
You're good. I believe, right, yeah, the studies are like use of a baton, right? Like non-lethal forces, like patting someone down, having them like step out of the car. I don't know if tasers are considered in those. I'm not sure exactly, but it's like anything where it's like not me shooting you, but like me touching you, me getting my hands on you as a police.
Give me a second here. My dog is barking in the back.
Go for it.
Yeah. All right. Okay. He was already kicked out. All right.
No worries.
Yeah. Sorry. I had the noise in the background. I sort of got cut off there because my dog was crying.
It's perfect. Do you want to Do you have more to say? Do you want to continue your train of thought, or?
No, yeah. What I was going to say is that this study found that non-lethal use of force was disproportionately used more often against Black Americans than white Americans, um, which is sort of a result that is very strange, right? You have you have two basically seemingly contradictory findings, uh, and there's a you would need a PhD in, I don't know, sociology, economics, and so many other things to actually try to explain that. That I'm not even going to try to explain that, but you do see what the data presents, right? And again, the data is imperfect, right? But it is data. That's the main thing.
Yeah, I think, right, and I think you're already touching on what I'm gonna say as like the contrarian supporter of putting on my like Black Lives Matter supporter hat is there are like as with any statistical analysis, right? Like the data is limited, right? Drawing conclusions from a single study is we like can't, right? Like that's not good science, right? Like if anyone's ever done any studies in any like uh field of like field of academic work, right, where you're publishing papers and you're analyzing data, right, it's always like we need more data, we need more of this. And after like years and years and years, and we run like 17,000 meta analyses of all these papers, and we see something that's repeated over and over and over again, and like a correlation that we can't seem to get to go away, then we finally are able to say as like good scientists that this is something that like exists or does not exist in the world. So I think the defenders of BLM say something like and this was kind of discussed on our Reddit too, which is like it's presumptuous to draw conclusions from a single study. And there's like with any study, I don't know if it's worth it going through them, but like you can begin to poke holes in the no analysis is perfect, specifically of like social sciences and trying to try to understand broad social trends, right, in a country of 300 million people. It's almost impossible to get good clean data, right? One of the common critiques is this data is only given to FRIAR or these studies from police departments who allow their data to be given, right? So obviously if you're a police department with a shitload of shootings and you know you have a bunch of problems, and FRIAR comes to your door and is like, hey, can I use your like shootings data for my study at Harvard, you're going to be like, actually, how about no, because like it's going to make us look bad. So there's lots of confounding stuff. It's hard to draw, right? And you're being very careful, right? We're not trying to draw definitive conclusions, and you've kind of couched yourself against this critique already. But what do you say to that, right? What do you say to people who say the data is too limited, the studies are too flawed for us to be drawing these conclusions that like it's not actually a problem, that like there's not actually a racial disparity in shootings, in police shootings, saying nothing of the fact of whether or not we should of like shootings in general, right? Critiques of shooting in general, but the idea that they're racially motivated seems to be lacking in evidence.
Well, first of all, I want to point out to the FRIAR study that you mentioned that yes, the data points, some of the data points that were used were drawn from police reports. However, they actually point this out in the report itself. They acknowledge that there exists a possibility for bias in these data points, but they used other sets of data points as well, exactly because of that reason. They use reports, population reports, right? Reports from the people of these neighborhoods itself. I think there are two data sets involved in the research. I forgot what the other data set was called, but it is in the study. And again, I mentioned not only the FRIAR study but several others that found basically that it had similar results as the FRIAR studies had. The ones that I mentioned prior all found that basically police tend to be utility maximizers, and they found that that there's no statistical significance between basically the use of lethal force and a person's race.
And I think, and I'll take off my contrarian hat.
Yeah.
And I think the strongest point made with this data in these and I mean, I think we have to concede, right? There's not a wealth of data, right? Like there's not overwhelming statistical evidence, right, or anything like that. But I think the strongest point made by this data is that at the bare minimum, the idea that there's a problem with racially motivated police shootings in the United States is at bare minimum a very, very open question,
Yeah.
right? There is at the very least no overwhelming data in either direction, right? So I think it's a bit strange that the BLM movement, right, kind of stands on the position of you must show me overwhelming evidence that there is not, right, racially motivated shooting, versus me trying to come to you with overwhelming evidence that there actually is a racist, racialized problem in the police force. And I think from a anti BLM person or someone who's kind of pushing back against these ideas, it seems to me that the more logical position would be, if you're claiming that there is a broad systemic racist problem with police shootings in the United States, you should be the one actively searching out evidence and actively trying to present an overwhelming case with as much data as you can possibly garner that this is in fact the case, right? As opposed to what seems to currently be happening, which is opposite, right? Everyone seems to be operating from the premise that we do have, that by all accounts, we have a racial police problem. And unless we can present overwhelming evidence against that, we must assume that there's a problem with racialized shootings. What do you say to that?
The problem, Max, is you see cases like what happened with George Floyd, which are cases that are absolutely appalling, right, and completely morally reprehensible, and it definitely shows, it exposes issues with the way police handle these kinds of situations, right? Um, However, the fact is, you take these data points, and again, the news, the media picks these anecdotal stories, right, about, and of course, you know, obviously the world isn't perfect, so there are going to be police interactions that are, where the police is clearly and obviously wrong, and the subject, um, the victim, is black. And perhaps some of these cases they were explicitly racist. However, these are, again, these comprise less than, I don't know, I believe it's definitely less than 3% of all police interaction. Is even less than that, I believe. Um, Although don't quote me for certain on that, but
It's definitely extremely low. We
it
have
is
something
extremely low. Yeah.
like millions upon hundreds of millions of police interactions every year, and some very, very small portion of those interactions, like the overwhelming majority of those interactions, are in fact non-violent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because what is the police? What are most police doing? Traffic stops, pulling you over, giving you a ticket, the tail lights out, what have you, right? Like that's the
And
vast majority of them.
another thing I hear a lot from the movement that I have a big problem against is basically the call for the abolition of the police, right? Which is, uh, which in my opinion is, you don't want a world without police. The fact that in America you are able to call a 3-digit number and you have somebody show up at your door, you know, somebody armed show up at your door to protect you is, you know, it's a privilege, right?
And I know just real quick, I know we're pushing back against this idea of like your lived experience, but like if you care to share, it seems that you do personally have you have experience living in countries where
Yeah.
that is not a thing. That is not the norm. The norm is not that you can call
Yeah.
911 and the police will show up in a timely manner and help you, and not offer, and you don't have to bribe them or anything like that.
Absolutely. I was actually going to mention exactly that. Although I'm not um, exposing my identity in the video, I think it's safe to say that I'm an immigrant, and I come from a country where, if you call the police, they don't show up. Either they don't show up or they show up 2 or 3 hours later, and they do so only in order to say that they did show up, and just basically write a report, and that's it. But you don't feel safe, right? Like the police is not there to you begin to question what they're there for, right? And again, it's not a police force really. It's something that doesn't work, right? And here, if you call the number, the police show up, right? And they definitely show up within the hour, which is um, significant, and not every country has that, right? Um, and I think again, uh, the fact that we gave this monopoly on legitimate violence to the state, right? The use of legitimate violence to the state is a brilliant invention. Basically, probably the best since sliced bread. I don't know, because you can rely on basically a to what is a great extent a sort of non-biased medium to solve, to use violence or force in order to protect the population. And you don't have to rely on people taking matters into their own hands, right? Um, which I mean, if you just look at places that don't have a reliable police force, it just devolves into chaos, right?
Absolutely. And I think, so putting on my contrarian hat again, I think my devil's advocate side, I think, again, this is kind of a tough, playing this side is always a little bit tougher because, again, the first thing we covered, right, is the lack of leadership and kind of coherence in the movement. So attempting to know, like, it's just tough, right? And we've kind of already covered this, but right, we can certainly recover it, of course, when it comes to these more specific slogans, right? Some people say abolish the police, some people say defund the police, some people, and everyone means a different thing when they say that, right? So I think in my opinion, the strongest argument, if I was going to give BLM, like, I think it's their best day in order to help be fair and attempt to be fair, is something like, and it's usually when people don't say abolish the police, but when they say like defund the police, and you see especially like high profile people like AOC and Rashida Tlaib and these members of Congress saying defund the police, they'll say, right, like they'll say defund the police, and then you'll be like, wow, that's really radical. And their response will be, actually, what defund the police really means is taking some of these like large police budgets and reallocating them in ways that are like better thought out, right? Like we don't need police, like overworked police officers dealing with every single encounter that they have to deal with, right? Like police are not trained to deal with like someone having a homeless person having a schizophrenic episode on the middle of Broadway, right? Like that's not that's not what you've been trained for, right? We need different people who are specialized in those kind of things, doing that things. And what you'll get is like, and that's actually good for police too, right? Like police don't want to be doing those jobs. That's not what they're trained to do. They don't want to be dealing with things that are far outside the purview of the job they've been trained for and signed up for. So it's like a net benefit. I think that's the most coherent and thoughtful position of BLM, and that's kind of where me and Keegan agreed a lot on and talked a lot about, which was this, like, I think it's hard to say that our police are not overworked, our police are not asked to do far too much, far outside of their training. So I guess if I just toss that to you, what do you say to that? Do you have specific, and you can take it any way you want, right? Do you have specific arguments with that argument itself, or would you like to focus more on the approach? Do you think the approach is the wrong way? The fact that you have people saying abolish the police and meaning abolish the police, right? What do you say to that, I guess?
I saw this discussion that you and Keegan had, and I think that point that was made was brilliant. I think that clarification, because I actually learned a lot from that I didn't know before, right? And it's a point that helps people sympathize with the movement, and I certainly helped me sympathize with that aspect of the movement. But again, you do mention the problem that when you say defund the police, it is not clear what is meant by that, right? That's where I think a little bit more clarification could be helpful. Yeah. Let me think.
No, you're good. That's fine. Right. Like and then that's kind of what they say, right? Supporters of BLM will often say, right, like defund the police is an intentionally provocative statement, right? It's like good marketing, right? Because we wouldn't be having a discussion. You don't get to step two where we as supporters of the movement get to say, well, actually, when we say defund the police, we mean these like substantive policy changes and rethinking the way we doing policing because of like actually well thought out issues. Unless I get you to engage with me by saying something kind of outlandish like defund the police, right? And you can agree with that or disagree with that. I think it's hard to say that it's not it is effective in the sense that like it does spark conversation. Now I think there's a question about how substantive that conversation is because it's so kind of infuriating and kind of
Limited, yeah.
yeah and purposefully. So it's a question about how well the conversation that is generated after that is like how useful it is. But I think it's hard to say that it's not an effective way to change the entire way we discuss policing in the United States, right? And they did that extremely effectively in the span of like a couple months, right? No one was considering reallocating funds for police departments or like changing the job description of police officers until this started, right? So I think you have to give them their due on that. Like it was in fact successful.
Absolutely. I think slogans and things like that, and basically these short statements, do get the attention of the people, right? It brings the issue at least to the table. Um, However, I think uh, what I would pose here is that I believe there are better approaches, and the one, for example, the one I mentioned previously is bring leaders to the forefront, right? Because as much as these slogans help, they're also um, they, they, in some ways they are misleading, right? To some people, and that's where leaders come in and help clarify basically what the movement is about, right? They are spokespeople, um, and they give clarification to these sort of they basically take this cacophony of voices and they centralize it and make it reasonable and make it well understood by people, not only people that are perhaps skeptic outside of the movement that are trying to sympathize, but also people within the movement that don't might not really know um, where they stand, right?
Yeah, and we kind of discussed, we used this example off air too, right? Which is like the example of people who did this thing very well, right? Like drawing clear borders of who is under your flag and what do you guys stand for and what do you represent, right? Like the conservatives in the Reagan era and like beyond were extremely good at this, right? We're extremely good at denouncing, and now everything has become quite confused with Trump. So maybe as everything, like drawing a line at 2016 and saying we need an entirely different understanding of like the universe after Trump was elected. But before that, right, the conservatives were very, very good at being like, right, we denounce David Duke, we denounce neo-Nazis who want to like claim the mantle of conservatism to try to legitimize themselves. That is not who we are, because they have like very powerful centralized leadership sending down, right? And this has nothing to do with whether or not you agree with the conservative ideology, but they have a very distinct ideology that was like brought down from on high. And like, if you did not agree with that, you were not allowed to consider yourself conservative, right? So they drew their boundaries very well. And this is something that, as we kind of keep pointing out, that BLM has been unable to do because of this lack of centralization of power. I guess, yeah,
again,
go for it.
lack of you mentioned it perfectly, this lack of basically coherence and having well-defined points sort of fuels the other side, right? It sort of fuels the side of Trump, right, which is sort of a populist opposition that takes these slogans and basically points out what's wrong with them. It's like and basically uses that to fuel the other side, which is simply sort of as incoherent, if not more, right?
Absolutely.
It helps, and this lack of definition helps no one besides these oftentimes illegitimate opposition, right?
Sure. Right. It leaves you open. It leaves you open to this critique of, right, to say, and it leaves you open to Sean Hannity coming on every night on Fox News and running wall-to-wall coverage of Portland, of like fires in Portland and people throwing stuff at police, and being able to say, this is Black Lives Matter, right? This is all they have to offer. This is all they're saying. They're just a bunch of like crazy anarchist, pink-haired college liberals who think it's like fun to try to kill, like to try to burn down courthouses and stuff. Because you don't have someone who can then come out and be like, this is not us. We denounce this. This is not BLM. They do not stand for us, because you don't have that person to look to. I think all that's great. If you, so we did a lot of like kind of critique of the substance. We did some substantive critique. We did some like structural critique of the movement itself. But it does seem, I wanted to kind of jump back to this systemic racism point, and kind of, right, because systemic racism comes along with a lot of then like policy prescriptions of like, how do you fix it, right? You have to change the system. You have to do like unconscious bias training. Again, like, it's kind of amorphous and it depends who you ask. But if you're rejecting that, what is your counterpoint to the solution, right? Because you don't seem to be denying that there is a problem of this kind of cyclical poverty and crime and violence in these minority communities. But what if the answer is not, right, systemic reform, right? It's not like equity councils or whatever Ibram X. Kendi is proposing, or this idea of unconscious bias training, or of like expanding welfare. What is the solution? How do we move forward addressing this problem in what you would consider a more accurate or substantive way?
Well, it's important, first of all, right, to point out the problems, and that's the easiest thing to do. and yeah, both sides tend to point out the problems more than actually offer solutions, because solutions are something that are extremely hard to come up with and know that they're going to work. But again, a lot of you see possible solutions, at least solutions that I believed of in the past and that I supported, which is basically fueling money into these inner city public schools, right? Which initially you believe to be, and I supported things like that, and I supported when they were being done. They have been done for the 2000s and 2010s. However, you're seeing very little positive results out of that, and perhaps that's because something like that takes time, or perhaps that's because of other factors as well, right? For example, even though you're putting money into these inner city public schools, you don't have teachers that want to teach there, right? You don't have basically this supply of people that are ready to teach in these public schools, like good professors, right? And you also see trouble. You also see lack of emphasis being placed on the importance of education, right? I think especially in these poorer communities, it's almost sort of like a mindset that no matter what you do, nothing's going to matter, right? Because the system is inherently racist, and you're just left here. So there's no point in, there's almost a discouragement in that fact, right? There's a lack of emphasis placed on the importance of education, and what you see is every Black person in America has to be famous in order to be rich, right? They have to be or either a sports athlete or a musician, right? In order to actually have money, which is terrible, because you get a complete lack of you don't have a middle class in that case, right? You don't have that rise in income status. You don't have a focus on professions that that are basically holistic and bring that that socioeconomic status up, like lawyers and medical professionals and stuff like that. You don't have emphasis on those kinds of professions in these communities, right? And again, it's as good of you probably have as good of a solution as I do. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem, right, is again, I agree, right? Like, there's no way, um, where you should stand, in my opinion, on like having social policy or anything is like whatever I think will work will probably fail, and probably not only fail, it will probably make things worse, right? Because that's usually what happens when we tinker with the mechanisms of society, right? We're really, really bad at doing anything from like top down
Yeah,
control in any way, and that's not a critique of like socialism or what have you, right? It's just a critique of like us as human beings when we tinker with complex systems, even though we think we're going to make it better, there's usually so many unforeseen variables that we're not taking into account that we actually end up making things the same or worse. So we should be very, very cautious in prescribing any sort of substantive like this change, right? But I think what you're getting at is, and I think it's where I probably come down to is like there's a way to thread the needle between the right and the left currently, right? Because the left, all they want to say is that, right, like you're held back systemically, and the right, what they want to say is that if you just like pull yourself up by your bootstraps or like work hard and keep your head down and make the right decisions, you can like improve your socioeconomic status. And I think it's kind of what sucks is that the breakdown of conversation between the right and the left has left us at a position where you have to choose between one of those two things. And it seems to me that both are clearly true, right? Yes, clearly you have like systemic problems born in the inner city that you would not have had if you were white and born in the suburbs, right?
and
But you also have the ability to make the right decisions and to work hard, and you can succeed, right? So like if there was a way to rehabilitate this conversation, which I think is why I'm so interested in having these conversations, is that there's an answer there, right? Like there's a way to discuss these things in a more nuanced, more interesting way, where it's not like you have no chance because of where you were born, but it's also that like things are harder for some people than others, right? Like that's just a fact as well. Um, yeah. Do you want to riff on that? Did you have something to say?
um, yeah. I also wanted to point out. I mean, it's again, it's complicated, but some people may point out in argument that um, yeah, these people can, they can try to succeed, but um, the system is built in such a way, again, the same argument, the system is built in such a way that they cannot. And they will say it has proven that that is the case, right? But then there are a few examples you can look at that basically point to the contrary, which is if you look at um, um, Black Americans that are of West Indian descent, right? And what I mean is like the Caribbean and places like Jamaica, and sometimes even places uh, like direct migrants from Africa, recent. Um, you see that these people from the West Indies, I mean, they look physically, they look the same, right, as African Americans that were descended from um, slaves back uh, way earlier, that have been Americans for a long time and have stayed in. Um, Basically, you see these immigrants coming to America, and a lot of them do succeed, right? There was um, a study done in Boston in the 70s that found that um, African Americans and not West Indian um, blacks, but African Americans who were descendants um, had basically a wealth, on average, a wealth of $8 to their name in the 70s, right? And that was all. That's very low, right? That's a very low. That's not living. You're not able to live on $8.
Right.
But if you look specifically at these immigrants from the West Indies, and sometimes um, um, even basically second generation, right? Um, uh, West Indies, uh, basically sons and daughters of these people who immigrated from the West Indies, you see that they had about on average $12,000 to their name, which is a significant difference from $8, right? So you see that these people don't look different um, physically, but you see this difference, right? Um, and again, you see a greater emphasis being placed on the importance of education. And again, there's obviously there's bias because these immigrants are coming in. We're picking the cream of the crop, right? The
Of
immigrants that
course.
are coming in are the cream of the crop. But again, if systemic racism is in fact existent, it shouldn't make a difference um, of whether you come from the West Indies or you're descendant of a slave here in America, right? If you are black, face you should be hindered in the same way, regardless of where you come from, right? But you see these families with a greater emphasis on the pursuit of education, and again, this is a lot of this is an immigrant mindset, right? A lot of immigrants that come to America, they have, um, regardless of color, from any place on earth, they have this mindset to focus on success, right? Um, and and that had, and again, that's where all these success stories come from, right? It's a sort of mindset that is fueled by uh, knowledge, that places emphasis on education, that places the emphasis on basically uh, the reality of the what used to be called the American dream, right? Of moving up in the social ladder. And a
Right.
lot of the times, and you see hundreds of these success stories, right? Um,
And I mean, the most obvious one, right, is obviously West Asian immigrants, right? Like
yeah,
immigrants from China and from Japan and from those countries, Korea, right? They have literally managed, right? Like they suffered discrimination and prejudice against them, of course, in very different ways than African Americans. So it's, of course, it can't be a direct comparison, like in any way. But like you see them come in and come to the United States, and despite discrimination and despite racism towards them, they were able to be. They're not only successful, they're so successful that they are now more successful than white people, right? Like
yeah. They
look,
comprise a majority in many different,
yeah, and you look at the
universities.
Harvard, they literally the Asian students at Harvard just brought a suit against the Supreme Court for Harvard discriminating against Asian students because they were so much better than everyone else that
Yeah,
you had to have higher test scores and like better applications as an Asian student just by virtue of the fact that you were Asian, because if they let in all the best students, almost everyone at Harvard would not be white but would be Asian, right? Like
yeah,
that's like the ultimate success story of like um this immigrant mindset, the thing you're talking about, right? Like coming in and dominating the culture,
yeah,
no matter what barriers they have, right? And my favorite example is always that like if you ever meet any of these like West Asian immigrants or first generation Americans, like of their they come from immigrant families um, at at basically anywhere, so especially at like these elite universities that they now like are so regularly at, you'll notice that they all have their like family names, and then they have the like names that they use at college, which is like a very distinctly white name, right? Like they'll be like, my actual name is whatever, it's like very Korean, you can tell. And then they'll be like, but like I go by like on my all my documents say like Maria or Jenny or
yeah,
like something very American, right? Which is the ultimate like, yes, we are aware that we might be picked against if we use extremely ethnic names, because people tend to choose white names, right? This goes back to the entire like famous study about applications. But instead of choosing to kind of like, and you're justifiably upset about that because that's justifiably unfair. But instead of being just upset about it, they found a workaround to continue to succeed in the system, which like however unfair that may be,
yeah.
the ability to do it is still like
And
astounding.
it is justifiably wrong that you have to change your name, right?
Of course, but
Um,
like, right. But the solution to them was like, once we are in the halls of power and once we do the right things and play the game in the way that must be played to
yeah,
get success and to get wealth and to build our own communities, we then have the ability to like fix the system from within, or to succeed regardless of the systemic or cultural barriers that have been placed in our way, which like I think any community can take that as like hopeful that like you can still do that, right? Like no matter the obstacles, no matter how unfair it is, you can not only succeed, but you can succeed at the highest levels of success
yeah,
if you're willing to like go the extra mile, no matter how unfair that is.
Yeah, it again, I agree wholeheartedly with that. That is a prominent example of it's a good mindset to have. And again, it's the same mindset that my parents sort of uh, imbued in me when we came to America, right? I would never be where I am now um, if we hadn't moved to America, and if my parents hadn't basically told me like, here you can, you can really be whoever you want to be, as long as you work for it. And if we had stayed, um, if we hadn't moved to America, I'm not sure I would, you know, um, have gotten as much from the education I received as I have now. I'm not even sure I would have made it into, a top of university or something like that. I look at my, again, I'll say where I'm from, which will make it easier. But I'm originally from Brazil, um, so looking at my friends back home who I left behind when I moved to America, you see a complete, basically, a complete misplacement of what's important, right? Misplacement of focus on what's important, right? No value for education whatsoever. Um, no value for, um, achieving, a higher economic status, higher than your parents, or putting in the work for it. It's almost like um, it is going to be what it is going to be, and unfortunately, in countries like Brazil, sometimes it is the case that um, it's very hard to move across um, socioeconomic um, ladders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're running a little long, but I think that was super great. I think it was super interesting. I don't know. I hope this conversation is continued. Obviously, there's always more to say. Um, but yeah, I thank you so much for coming on, Jack. It was fantastic, and we hope to have you back on again.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for inviting me. Um,
Bye, everybody.